Today's daf we're going to learn is Moed Katan daf tet. Today's daf is sponsored by Adina Pollack in loving memory of Shlomi Bat Bessie. Today's daf is sponsored by Leah Goldford in loving memory of her mother-in-law, Joyce Goldford, Zissel Pesel Bat Yehuda Bat Eliyahu Mordechai Alevi on her 11th year at site. Her motto was, if you don't have anything good to say nothing. This wasn't a mere expression, but the way she lived her life, always having something nice to say with her soft voice, mild manner, and beautiful smile. No lashon hara ever came out of her mouth. I miss her and hold the sweet memories of her in my heart. I hope I have internalized her lessons and passed them on to my children and grandchildren. May Neshama have an aliyah and may her memory be for a blessing. Today's daf is sponsored by Gabrielle and Daniel Altman in loving memory of the Honorable Miriam Altman Zichrona Livracha. She was a trailblazer for women's equality who would have been immensely proud of her 6 family members who were learning the daf and probably would have been learning it herself. With those beautiful dedications, we're going to start our daf. We ended with this concept of not getting married on Chol Moed. And then we said that there were 4 different reasons, even though normally the one that we hear is Eimar Bevim Simcha B'Simcha. You can't put 2 smachot and have them at the same time. You can't overlap them. Everything gets its spotlight. We want to give everything the proper attention it needs without detracting from either one. Then we moved to the fact that there were 3 other interpretations. I'll quickly review them. Either you're going to ignore the simcha of the regel, forget about having to split your time. You're going to just devote all your attention to the wedding, and maybe they're basically focusing on the husband to make his wife happy and the happiness he has with his wife, and ignore the happiness of Yom Tov. Number 3, Mipnei Torah, Ula says, it's a headache, right? It's a pain to make a wedding. You're going to work very hard. And what have we been talking about this whole Masechet? You're not allowed to work hard on the holiday. Number 4, Mipnei Bitul Pirya Rivya. We don't want people to push off their weddings because then that will push off having children. And that's the most important thing. So it's not the only important thing, but I'm saying it almost, that's okay. I should actually preface this by saying there's 2 sides to marriage in the Gemara. One is that there's the relationship of the husband and wife, and this also comes up in Sefer Breshit, and the relationship. And then there's the element of having children. And because there's this obligation to have children, so therefore they view this as very important and they want to rush it. It doesn't mean the only purpose of marriage is to have children, but it is saying that that is an important purpose. And therefore we want you to get to that mitzvah. We don't want you to push off that mitzvah. And since marriage is a way to get to that mitzvah, we don't want you to push off your wedding. Why would people push off their wedding? Well, because it's easier to do everything all at once. If you're already having guests and food and all that, you may as well do it all at one time. We don't want people to do that because then they'll push off their wedding, and we don't want that to happen. To now, the Gemara says, Meitive, the end of yesterday's daf, Kol elu she'amru asurin lisa b'moed, mutarin lisa erev haregel. And this is Kashya L'Kud. Okay, what does this mean? This is basically saying, when we say you can't get married on the Moed, right? The Almana, the Betula, the Yibum, they are actually permitted, though, yes, to do these things on the day before the Chag. Why is this difficult to all the opinions? So let's go through. If you say Lepisha Eimar Vim Simcha B'Simcha or Mipnei Sheminiach Simchat HaRegel or even Torah, what's the issue? All of those. Remember, the wedding was not just one day. The wedding was the 7 Yemei Mishteh after. So all of those are going to be equally applicable. If we do it on Erev Yantif, then you're going to have the 7 days of the holiday all filled with work and filled with happiness. It doesn't have to do with the holiday, and it's going to be an issue. And the one who says Mipnei Bitul Pirya Rivya is also a problem, because you're also going to then, if you could do it on Erev Chag, you'll push it off to Erev Chag, because then also it's still easier. You're still cooking food. You'll just cook some extra food, but you'll want to push it off till then. So now they say, no, lo kashya. We can explain each of these according to the source. Why? Leman damar mishum simcha ikar simcha chad yomahu. The first 2 that are all based on happiness, whether we're going to worry about you splitting or one's going to override the other, kind of make it not happen. Well, we're going to say that really the main simcha is the wedding. Yes, it's true. There's this Shiva Yemei Mishteh, which is interesting that they're kind of, rolling them under the carpet, saying they're not such a big deal, even though they do appear as a big deal in other places. But the 7 Yemei Mishteh are not as critical. It's really the one day of the wedding. And we do know this. I mean, it is true. The simcha of a wedding is much more than the Shava Brachot. So that's the main simcha. After that, yes, there'll be simcha, but it won't be so strong as to take away from the holiday. I think that's how you have to understand it. Same thing. The big thing is the wedding. That's the main tircha. After that, remember, we've been talking all along about tircha yatera and tircha that's not such a big deal. Shabbat bracha, not such a big deal. Okay, well, how are you going to work this one out? Well, because then really people will push it off till Erev Chag. People won't push it off for one day. What does that mean for one day? What do you mean? The wedding's always one day. The idea here is that if you push it off till Erev Chag, you say, instead of getting married in June, I'm going to get married in September, right before Sukkot. What's the problem? What happens if, okay, I'll put it in nowadays, right? What if you end up in quarantine that day and you have to push it off a day or two? Okay, so what will you do? Well, you push it off a day or two. But if you do this Erev Chag and all of Chag, you push it off to Erev Chag, knowing that the rest of that next week, if something happens, right? The weather's pouring. Let's say, in those days, they probably did the weddings outside often, or, we don't know. But whatever could happen, and unexpected things do come up, especially I assume in their day, it wasn't like nowadays, where it's unlikely people will change a wedding date other than in the last 2 years where people are constantly changing wedding dates. So we could really relate to it a little bit better. But the idea is that you won't want to push it off if you know that that's your main chance, and that if you miss that date and something happens, it has to be pushed off, you're going to end up, you won't be able to get married the next day, right? Or the entire week after. So no one's going to push off their wedding to Erev Chag if, right, they really want to get married some other time, they're going to push it off because it'll be easier for them. It's not really easier because in the end, they might get stuck. That's an interesting answer. Okay, now we're going to get to a source for Ein Marvim Simcha B'Simcha. And how do we know this, that we can't do this? Where did this idea come from? Well, we're going to learn it from here. We're going to spend half a daf on, or even a little bit more, get to from there, even most of today's daf actually, is all an outgrowth of this next source, which is we're going to now talk about the Chanukat HaMikdash of Shlomo HaMelech. When Shlomo HaMelech dedicated the temple, he made a big celebration. And the big celebration took place the 7 days before Sukkot. So we're going to basically show that because he did it 7 days before Sukkot, and he didn't do it on Sukkot, that's going to prove, okay, let's think about it. If Shlomo HaMelech is inviting the whole community to Jerusalem to celebrate the dedication of the temple, and then they all have to come to Jerusalem for the holiday. So it was nice he did one up against the other. But why didn't he just do it all at the same time? Could you imagine not going to work for 14 days? I mean, it sounds a bit like a dream, but it's a bit of a nightmare also. I mean, people have to work. They have to make money. They don't have money saved up that they can use. It's a bit of a pain for them to not work for 14 days, right? And forget about the travel time. So it would have been much smarter if he had just overlapped it with the holiday. So we're going to read that right now. He did his celebration. All of the Jewish people were with him. Kahal Gadol, Milavo Hamad, Anacha Mitzrayim, right? The whole country. Lifnei Hashem Elokeinu, before God. Shiv'at Yamim v'Shiv'at Yamim. That's 7 days before Sukkot. 7 days of Sukkot. Why it doesn't mention the 8th day? Okay, we'll have to put that question aside. Arba'a Asar Yom. 14 days. Okay, soon we'll get to why did it say 7 days and 7 days and 14 days, right? We know the 7 and 7 is 14. We'll have to get to that later. If we really hold that you could mix simcha and simcha, then you should have waited till the Chag and done it all at the same time. So the Gemara says that's not a good proof. Why is it not a good proof? Maybe we don't push something off, but if it happened to have, what are we assuming? We're assuming they finished the building of the temple exactly then, and that's why they did it then. Happened to be 7 days before Sukkot, but maybe you can't learn anything for a situation where what if it falls on that day, right? Like we know if you have a Brit Milah, you do it on the Chag. Right? There are certain things that happen on the Chag. So maybe you just don't push things off to the Chag, but if they fall on the Chag, if you happen to decide that's the ideal time to get married, maybe you could, because you can't really learn it from here because this is an example where they had no choice. To which they say, no, Ibaile l'shirei porta. He could have, you know what it's like. I mean, usually it's the opposite when you're doing construction or something. What happens? Usually they're always later than they say they're going to be, right? Here they're saying, why don't you push off and arrange it so that, right, I see Amy smiling because she's in architecture. So you see, they could have, done the last few things slowly, pushed it off, leave over one last thing and do it a few days later. That would have been good. And then, right, then again, Shlomo could have, this is the opposite of Eimar Rib Simcha B'Simcha. If there was no Arbim Simcha B'Simcha, no problem with it, he should have just had it overlap. To which they say, what are you talking about? Shiur binyan Beit HaMikdash lo mashayrina. Yes, I'm building my house. I could decide, listen, I only want to move in a few days. I'm going to leave one last thing and I'm going to do it then. I mean, again, this isn't so logical, but let's just say, but you can't do that when you're building the Beit HaMikdash. It's a mitzvah to build the Beit HaMikdash. You can't just push it off, say, I'll do this another day. To which they said, well, it's true the main parts of the temple are unique, have sanctity. You can't just push them off. You have to keep going and don't push off building them. But what about this part of the Beit HaMikdash, which is not critical to the Beit HaMikdash, or we'll see, and that this is like a really good, interesting question. They say, there was this thing on the top of the roof, these spokes, these metal spokes that were on top of the roof of the temple to basically catch the ravens, okay, to kill, so that the ravens stayed away from the temple, right? You know what it's like, especially in Jerusalem. I've been in places where there's tons of birds everywhere. They didn't want birds everywhere, right? First of all, the mess and all of that. So they had these spokes to keep away the ravens. So now they say, well, why didn't they just delay that a few days? Okay, to answer your question, Fiona, I'll explain what I mean in case it wasn't clear. What we're trying to say here, we're in the middle of trying to say, let's learn from Shlomo HaMelech that he did the celebration 7 days before. It must be because Ein Marvim Simcha B'Simcha. The Gemara is now trying to say, no. Maybe he didn't do it because he had no choice, because that was the day he finished building the temple. To which they say, well, maybe he could have delayed something a few more days. And if he delayed it a few more days, then the temple celebration would have fallen out exactly with Sukkot. It would have been much more convenient for people. And then maybe, right? So if we say that he could have pushed it off and he didn't, then we'd have a proof. But if we say he couldn't have pushed it off and he had no choice, then we actually don't learn from here anything, because we're just saying he had no choice. In the end, that's what we're going to say. We're going to say we can't learn from here. It's really that Shlomo had no choice because that's when the temple was finished being built. And therefore, it has nothing to do with our topic of Ein Marvim Simcha B'Simcha. But the Gemara keeps trying to suggest he still could have, so he can't put off building the temple, but he could have put off building these spokes. And then we'd say, well, listen, right, this is classic when you're doing construction. There's one last thing left. You can't move in because you want to have everything finished, right? There's always those things that get left. Why don't you just leave that? It's not critical to the building of the temple in the sense of it's not a sanctified, it's not like building the sanctuary or something like that. Just push off these spokes. It's not part of Binyan Beit HaMikdash. To which the Gemara says, no, we couldn't have pushed that off either. Because, and as you'd have to say you'd have to say on the one hand, it's not critical. On the other end, they weren't going to do the celebration until that was in place, which makes sense because you didn't want birds ruining your whole event. So the answer, no, everything in the temple is part of Binyan Beit HaMikdash. And those spokes are just as important. I don't know, just as important, but very important. Like the temple, like everything in the temple is important, the Mizbeach, right? It's like a way of saying that even mundane things in the temple become sanctified. This is important. This has sanctity to it. And therefore, he couldn't have pushed it off, which means that we can't learn anything from here about Ein Marvim Simcha B'Simcha. The reason he did 7 days before Sukkot was because that's when it was finished. And he had no choice about the date. He couldn't play with it because there's the mitzvah of building the Beit HaMikdash, and you can't just start pushing things off, even something as mundane as these spokes on the roof. So the Gemara now is going to learn it from a different part of the same verse. And this is something I mentioned earlier. There's extra words in that pasuk. It says 7 days, 14 days. Why does it tell you 14 days when we know that 7 plus 7 equals 14? Why do you need to say 7 and 7 once you said 14? Or the reverse. It's teaching you that there were 7 days of celebration for the Mikdash, 7 days celebration of the holiday of Sukkot, and you can't mix them. And that's where we learn it from. So not that someone didn't have a choice and he could have planned it better, and he didn't because of Ein Marvim Simcha B'Simcha, but yes, we learn it from this verse because of the way the verse appears. Okay, so now we're going to say the following. Amar Rabbi Parnach Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Ota Shana, fascinating line, get ready for this. Lo asu Yisrael et Yom Kippurim. They didn't celebrate Yom Kippur. Why? Because the 7 days before Sukkot include Yom Kippur. And they were busy celebrating this festival for the temple dedication. And they couldn't do Yom Kippur, so they didn't do Yom Kippur. Okay, soon we're going to see how did they think that this was okay and all that. So now they say, they didn't do Yom Kippur according to Rabbi Yochanan, v'hayu doagim v'omrim. Okay, just to point out, if you want to read more about this, it's a very interesting topic. Rav Yoel ben Nun has a whole halach about this where he talks about it. I don't know where it is, but I'm sure if you look it up, you can probably find it. But he has a whole theory about this whole thing about why they didn't do Yom Kippur that year. The people were worried and they said, Shemen etchayvu sonehem shel Yisrael. Klaya, sonehem shel Yisrael is what we call lashon seginaho. They said maybe the Jewish people themselves, instead of those who hate the Jewish people, it means ourselves, maybe we should be destroyed because we didn't do Yom Kippur that year. Right? Could you imagine skipping Yom Kippur, right? That's a central part of people's Jewish year. So, heavenly voice comes down and says, you're all invited to be in the world to come. You all have a place, which means it was okay. So now we have to understand a few things. First question, my Darish, what did the people think when they thought that they could do this on Yom Kippur? Amru kavachomer. They made a kavachomer from the tabernacle. Now, when they dedicated the tabernacle, what happened? This is in Parshat Naso. The Nisiim, each of the heads of each tribe, 12 of them, brought their own sacrifices, and they brought a whole bunch of things to the temple. They brought a gift and sacrifices, and we're going to assume right now that they did it on Shabbat. Soon we'll get to how do we know they did it on Shabbat. But the point is they brought sacrifices, their own, and we're going to call it a korban yachid because it was an individual, each one for themselves. Yes, it was true, it was for a communal celebration, but it was their own individual offering. And we say here, Uma mishkan she'en kedushato kedushat olam v'korban yachid doche Shabbat isur skila. The Mishkan, okay, we're now going to compare a few things. The Mishkan doesn't have sanctity forever. Next, the Korban Yachid, they did a Korban Yachid when they dedicated the Mishkan, the tabernacle. It was an individual sacrifice, and it overrode Shabbat. Shabbat is the highest. It's Isur Skila, okay? You get stoned. So if all that overrides Shabbat, Mikdash, Dikdushato Kedushat Olam, its sanctity is there forever, right? That's why no one goes now, right? And the place in the Temple Mount, forget about the rules. But even if you could, right, we're very careful. We view that there's still sanctity there. So Mishkan, She'enkedu, right, the place, what I'm talking about is specifically the place where the Kodesh Kodeshim is. Huma Mishkan, She'enkedushato Kedushat Olam, Mikdash Dikdushato Kedushat Olam, Ve Korban Tzibur. And here we're talking about communal offerings is what they offered then. Ve Yom Kippurim, da Anush Karet, right? And Yom Kippurim is only karet. It's not skila. I mean, karet is pretty big, but it's not as harsh as skila. Lo kol sheken. So if we have all these other things where the kedusha is more important, the sacrifice is more important, and yet the day is less important. So of course it's going to override Yom Kippur. That was the kal v'chomer they made. So now we have to understand el amayu doagim. So what were they worried about then? Well, hatam tzorach gavoa, hachat tzorach hidyot. There it was for gavoa. It was going, the sacrifices were going to God. Here, the sacrifices were going so they would have a festival and what to eat. And it was part of the festivities. They were eating and drinking. And what did they do on Yom Kippur? Right there, what did they do? They brought sacrifices. That was their Chilul Shabbat. Here, the Chilul Shabbat is eating and drinking. That's for their own sake. It's forbidden to eat and drink on Yom Kippur. So maybe it's different. So they say, so why didn't that year, maybe, right, they could have just said, we'll do the sacrifices as part of the Chanukah Mikdash, but we won't eat and drink. Maybe they should have just abstained from eating and drinking that day. That's possible. Well, no, it's not possible because they're working on an assumption on a pasuk in Devarim that when you sanctify the Mikdash, they learn from there that you have to be happy in front of God. And therefore, happiness is with eating and drinking because we're Jews and that's how we rejoice. So therefore, since happiness is, right, not just because we're Jews, but it says so in the Torah, right? Our simcha is always associated with eating and drinking. Therefore, there was no way they could have had this festivity without eating and drinking. And that's why they ate and drank on Yom Kippur. Now we have an aside, because we said the Mishkan is Dochesh Shabbat. How do we know that they actually did these korbanot of the Nisiim, of the heads of the tribes on Shabbat? Mishkan de Dochesh Shabbat minalan. There it lists on the first day, on the second day, on the third day, on the fourth, on the fifth, on the sixth, right? All the way till 12. So when it says on the first day, we must mean Sunday. And on the seventh day, we must mean Shabbat. If that's how you want to say, we know they did it on Shabbat. You don't necessarily have to say that because maybe it's the first day they brought the sacrifices. It doesn't necessarily mean it was Sunday. When it says day number 7, it doesn't mean the 7th day of the week. It means 7th day from which they started bringing the sacrifices. So Amar Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak Amar Kra B'yom Ashtei Asar Yom. Each day it says B'yom Rishon, B'yom Hasheni. Then when it gets to day number 11, it says B'yom Ashtei Asar. That's 11. Yom. It says Yom twice. So they say we learn from Yom. Ma Yom Kulo Ratzuf Af Ashtei Asar Kulam Ritzufim. Just like a day, there's never a break in the day. You don't stop a day in the middle and bring a different day in or take a break. A day is always a day. Same thing. So it's continuous. Likewise, these days must have been continuous days. That's how we learn it, from the 11th, from the extra word of day. The Gemara says, the Dilma Yamim HaReuyim, maybe it means it was continuous, excluding Saturday, okay, excluding Shabbat. This would be like in our terminology, right? When you say I'm doing a delivery and they say we'll be there in 7 business days, right? It doesn't include weekends. That's exactly what they're saying. Maybe when it means days, it means, yes, it's 12 days in order, excluding Shabbatot. Very likely it could mean that. To which they say, well, K'tiv Kra'achrina, there's another pasuk that has the same thing. B'yom Shnei Masar Yom, also on the 12th day that the prince, the Nisiim, the heads of tribes, brought the korban, it also says Yom twice. So from there we learn, Ma Yom Kulo Ratzuf, Af Shnei Masar Yom Kulam Ritzufim. From there we learn it was continuous, including Shabbat. To which the Gemara asks, why don't you say there it's also business days, not including the weekends? In Kantrei Krai Lamali, it basically says, why did it need to repeat Yom in the 11th day and also in the 12th day? It must be because the 2 psukim are to teach you, it must mean continuous, okay? If you had just one, you might have thought it's only business days, excluding the weekend. Now this comes to teach you the double. The second time it comes to teach you, no. It was really in order. And from there we learn that the Mishkan overrode Shabbat. Now they ask another question, which is a bit of a strange question because we thought we answered this question. Mishkan didoche Yom Kippurim minalan. How do we know that Mikdash didoche Yom Kippurim minalan? How do we know that the Mikdash overrode Yom Kippur? Now, didn't we say before Kal V'chomer, right? So it's a little bit strange. But what it seems to be saying here is, the way I understood it eventually was, how do we know that really they didn't in reality they didn't do it? Not that halachically, why did they do it? Why did they think it was okay? But how do we know that they actually didn't keep Yom Kippur that year? Maybe they did it 7 days before, the same way we just said business days, right? Maybe it excludes weekends. Maybe the 7 days before excluded Yom Kippur. So how do we know that they actually did it? Right now, they're not bringing halachic answers, they're bringing a proof from that verse. If you say, because it says Arba Asar Yom, still, it doesn't mean anything. Maybe it's only days that are not holidays, right? Not Yom Kippur. Gamar Yom Yom Mehatan. They say, no. Because it says Arba Asar Yom, they're now going to learn the Yom from the Mishkan Yamim, from the Nisiim, and say that just like their day meant Ratzuf, including Shabbat, here Yom means including Yom Kippur, and from there we prove that they did this. Now we're going to get back to this bat kol. Yatzta bat kol v'amra lehem kulchem muzmanim l'chayei ha'olam haba. Yeah, I saw somebody write, what, a bat kol? How can we don't listen to bat kols? First of all, it's true we don't listen to bat kols. That's when it comes to halachic issues. This isn't a halachic issue. This is just telling us a story of what happened. When they did this, they didn't do Yom Kippur, and it was okay by God. And how do we know this? From the sign of this heavenly voice that came down. It's not exactly, yes, it's talking about a halachic issue, but a historical halachic issue. It's a little bit different. That's how I view it. So, and we did see at the end of Megillah that there is a kind of way that a bat kol can be used. That's something different, though. Again, here we're not even using the bat kol. We're just saying that this is what happened. And said, you're all welcome to the world to come. Minalan da'achile. How do we know that God said it was okay that they did this? Ditane tachlifa. Tachlifa brought a braita, b'yom hashmini shilach ha'am, and this sentence, this pasuk, is going to take us for a while of today's daf. On the 8th day, Shlomo sent the people home, okay, which is a little weird because it's Shmini Atzeret, okay, but basically maybe they finished the work on Shmini Atzeret and he said you can all go home. We'll see later that they didn't go home till the following day, obviously, because it was Chag. Anyway, he says he sends the people of Yivarchu et HaMelech, they bless the king, and that part isn't important for us now, although we're going to get to it later. But the end of that pasuk is important. They went back to their tents, smichim, happy, v'tovei lev, they felt good in their hearts. Al kol tova asher asa Hashem, on all the good that God bestowed. Li David avdo, for David his servant, which is very strange. David was dead. L'Israel amo, and to the Jewish nation. So we're going to darshan these words. Lo alehem. The first ones aren't going to be relevant to us. Shalchu matzu nishehem b'tara. When they all came home, they found their wives were all tahorot, meaning they can have relations with them. They weren't in nida. Smechim shenenu miziv hashchina. Right? In other words, imagine they went away for 14 days. They come home and their wives, right? Their wives were in nida. That would have been not so pleasant. Anyway, they came home. Their wives were all tahorot, pure. Smechim nehenu miziv hashchina. They were happy because they had come in contact with the Shechina when they were there. Tovei lev shekol echad ve'echad nitabra ishto beben zachar. All the wives conceived male children. Male children in the Gemara is always perceived as the end all be all. We always have to take that with a bit of a grain of salt, right? We're always obviously happy when we have boys and girls. In those days, there was this big emphasis on having boys. Al kola tova sheyatzta bat kol va'amra lehem kulchem muzmanim l'chayei olam haba. Here we have it. What was the good that was bestowed upon them? That God said you're all going to get rewarded by having a share in the world to come, right? That the bat kol came down, a heavenly voice. L'David avdo l'Yisrael amo. So bishlama l'Yisrael amo that we get. What was the good that was bestowed on the Jewish people? Exactly what we just said. That because they had basically eaten and drunk on Yom Kippurim, and yet they were getting the share in Olam Haba, that's what the Jewish people got. What did David get? Now we're going to see here a story, which I believe we saw this whole story before. Yes, in Masechet Shabbat Daf Lamed, we saw the story. When Shlomo goes, we're at this big celebration, he goes to bring the Aron into the Kodesh Kodeshim, right? The Ark. It's the most holiest item into the most holiest of places. What happens? Terrible thing happens. The gates of the Kodesh Kodeshim will not open. They're stuck to each other. Amar Shlomo. It's late, right? I'm just thinking this isn't what happened, but you think about when you do construction and then you build it in such a way that it just can't open, and anyway, obviously that wasn't what happened, but something happened and they got stuck to each other, right? Seems to be that it was destined by God to be this way. Amar Shlomo esrim va'arba rinanot v'lo na'ana. He used 24 languages of prayer and he wasn't answered. Patach va'amar. Then he says, Se'u sha'arim rashechem. This is where, right, the famous paragraph of Tehillim we say a lot in our prayers. The gates should open up. V'lo na'ana. It didn't help. Kevan shamar. Once he said this pasuk, which appears in Divrei Yamim, Hashem Elokim al tashev pnei mashichecha. Don't turn your face away from me, right? It was like, he felt like God was turning his face here. I did this, Binyan Beit HaMikdash, and then all of a sudden, no, I can't even get the Aron Kodesh in. And he says, not the Aron Kodesh, but the Aron. And then he says, Zachra lechaskei David avdecha. In the pasuk there, it says, remember the chesed of David, your servant. Miyad na'ana. As soon as he mentions David HaMelech, all of a sudden, he gets entryway in. So why was the tova? What was the tova that God did for David HaMelech? Well, all of David's enemies turned blackened like the bottom of a pot that gets black, right? They basically had nowhere to go, nothing to say, because it was clear that God basically approved of David. And what was really clear, right? So the same way the tova the Jewish people got was that God pardoned them for their sin, that they worked on Yom Kippur. Likewise, David was pardoned for his sin. It's a little bit different, I have to say. They're two different things because David actually sinned and God pardoned him. The Jewish people, it's not so clear if they actually sinned. We kind of said that they had reason to do it and it wasn't really considered a sin that they would need. But it means that God basically approved of what they did. So it's a little bit different, the two approvals here. So we're talking for David, in case it wasn't clear, I thought I said it, but that David for his sin with Bathsheba, right? Okay. Now, since we had this story about Shlomo and the Chanukah Mikdash, and we quoted this verse about on the 8th day, he sent the people home, and it says in the pasuk, Vayivarchu et HaMelech, the people blessed the king. So now we're going to get to two stories where people take they part with someone. Okay, we're going to learn about the parting, and we're going to learn about the bracha. Okay, so Rabbi Yonatan ben Asmai, the Rabbi Yehuda ben Gerim. Okay, you might remember him from Shabbat Daf Lamed, famous story of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and Yehuda ben Gerim. Anyway, if you don't remember, you can look back there. I'm not going to get into that now, but we have another story with Rabbi Yehuda ben Gerim and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Right, this is all with the Romans, and this is how Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai gets sent to the cave. Tana runs away to the cave. Tanu Parashat Nidarim be Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So these two people are learning, these two rabbis are learning Nidarim, the Parsha of Nidarim, with Rabbi in the house of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. At night, they say they're parting ways. They say, we're going, goodbye. Litzafra, but they didn't leave. They slept overnight. In the morning, in the morning, they again say goodbye. Didn't we already part ways last night? Why are you doing this again? So Rabbeinu, you taught us. Okay, this is a good lesson. If you leave someone's house, right, in the morning, but you say goodbye to them at night, you have to say goodbye again in the morning when you leave. How do we know this? It's actually from Shlomo HaMelech, Shenemar, Bayom HaShmini Shilach et ha'am v'yirachot HaMelech. The first verse is from Sefer Melachim that we quoted before. On the 8th day, he sent them off on their way, and they blessed the king, right? They parted ways. Uchti. But there's a different verse, and they really seem to be contradictory verses. In Divrei Yamim, in Chronicles, it says, on the 23rd day of the 7th month, Shilach et ha'am. That's already the 9th day, not the 8th day. So how could it be both? The assumption is that they didn't leave on the 8th day because the 8th day was Shmini Atzeret. And they brought sacrifices. You have to remember, we learned about Lina, the chiyuv, to stay overnight in Jerusalem when you bring a sacrifice. So they had to stay over till the 9th. So it was exactly that. They were kind of done with the temple things on the 8th. So we said goodbye to them, but then they were still there overnight. And when they left in the morning, they said goodbye again. That's how they explain the contradiction here. It's interesting. The Gemara doesn't bring this as a contradiction. They just say, in fact, it says here that and here that. That's what we learn. So story continues. So Rav Shimon Bar Yochai's response is, he goes to his son. He says to his son, B'nei Adam halalu anashim shel tzura. These are serious people. They know what they're talking about, right? Because they basically one-upped him, really. He said, why are you doing this? And they had a good proof. So basically they say, they're good people. Zil gabehon delivarchu. Go get a bracha from them. So what we're going to see now is, first, a conversation they're having about the values of mitzvot and balancing mitzvot, which is similar maybe to the simcha b'simcha. And then after they have this discussion, they're going to bring two contradictory verses and then another two contradictory verses and resolve them similarly. And then they're going to start noticing him and giving him a bracha. But first, he's kind of eavesdropping on their conversation. Again, if we had time, we could go more in depth and try to figure out what this is all doing here. You can think about that. But right now we have a long daf, so we're going to keep going. So they're basically talking about contradictory psukim. Okay, basically map out the way you're going to, your steps and plan out every move. The way they understand this is, when you have mitzvot in front of you, choose the more important one, right? If you're in the middle of a smaller one, maybe go do a bigger one. You have to plan things out. In a different verse, it says, Orech Chayim pen yifales. The way of your world, don't start making decisions like this. You don't know what's a mitzvah gdolah, what's a mitzvah ktana. You're in a mitzvah ktana, stay with it. So lo kashya. Kam b'mitzvah she'efshar lasot al yedei acherim. Moving now to Amud Bet. Kam b'mitzvah she'ei efshar lasot al yedei acherim. It depends what kind of mitzvah it is. If it's a mitzvah, if you're involved in a mitzvah, okay, this is what the rabbis are basically saying. They bring up these contradictory psukim and then they resolve it by saying, if it's a mitzvah, that you're doing some small mitzvah and there's a big mitzvah that comes to your hands. If the small mitzvah is something you could give someone else to do, then let them do that and you go to do the bigger mitzvah. But if not, then stay with your mitzvah that you're dealing with. Then they continue and say, the Torah is more precious than pearls. Anything else you want to do, your needs are not as important to Talmud Torah. So don't do Talmud Torah, don't stop Talmud Torah to do all sorts of mundane things. But because it says chafatzecha, your own, it seems to imply hacheftzei shamayim yishvu ba. But mitzvot are on par with Talmud Torah. So let's say we learned this in Masechet Megillah. Comes time for Megillah, you're learning Torah. You stop learning Torah to hear the Megillah. Because even though you're not supposed to stop learning Torah for other things, it says chafatzecha, your own things you're not supposed to stop, but for God's things like mitzvot, you can. But it also says in another verse, these are in the same book, they're both in Mishlei. Yeah, they're both in Mishlei. It says, Kol chafatzim lo yeshvu ba. Any chafatzim, not chafatzecha, your chafatzim, any chafatzim, don't compare to Torah, which makes it sound like you can't stop learning Torah for anything. Even for mitzvot. So again, what do we answer? And here we'll see, does Megillah fall into this category? If you can't, no one else can do it for you, like Kriya Megillah, then you stop learning Torah. But if you're learning Torah and there's a mitzvah, let's say there's a poor person who comes and someone else in the house can give them tzedakah and you're busy learning, so have someone else do it. Don't stop what you're doing in order to do the mitzvah. Have someone else do it for you. Some mitzvah people can do for you. Some mitzvah you have to do by yourself. And therefore, that's how we distinguish. So that's how they resolve both these contradictions. In the meantime, they notice he's there. Amrule, my bayitachi. They say, what are you doing here? What do you need? My father said, go get a bracha from you. Amrule, Yehei Rava. So they now start their bracha. And this is a little Bilam-like, okay? Bilam wanted to curse the Jewish people. In the end, it comes out like a bracha. They wanted to bless him, or at least he was looking for a blessing. And what sounds like is coming out of their mouth sounds like a bit of a curse. So let's see. And it's also not 100% clear what they mean. Yehei Rava de tizra velo techtzad. You should, I wish you, right, that okay, God should wish you that you plant and you won't reap the rewards, you won't get anything. Okay, techtzad is not so clear what it translates as, but it sounds like a pretty bad word, like whatever you plant isn't going to grow to anything. Ta'aya velo tipok, you'll bring in, but you won't bring out. And tipok velo ta'ayil, you'll bring in and you won't let out. Okay, we don't know exactly what this means either. Lichruv beitach, your house should be destroyed. That sounds pretty bad. V'leitavush pizach, and you'll have to go as a guest somewhere else. Libal bel ptorech, your table should be all confused, all messed up. V'lotechze shatachadatan, you won't see the new year. This sounds pretty awful. Well, this poor guy, right, went for a bracha. Ki anta gabe avua, he goes back to his father and he says to his father, Amarle, lo mebaya debruche lo barchan. It's bad enough they didn't give me a bracha, but about siura, they said terrible things to me. I'm traumatized. Amarle, my amrulach. So Rosh Hashanah says, what did they say? Hachi v'hachu amarle. So he says this is exactly what they said. Amarle hanach kulu birchatani. He says these are all blessings. Okay, you have to just learn to understand what he said. Okay, this is like looking on the cup is half full or half empty, or really just saying you have to really think about what they said and see the bracha in it. And maybe this is also in terms of when you have a dream and you interpret it, right? If it gets interpreted well, then it'll be good. And if it gets interpreted poorly, then it'll be bad. We saw that in bracha. Maybe this is Rav Shimon Bar Yochai's interpretation of the bracha so that it will come true, right? You have to wonder what was their original intent. We don't really know, but here he comes with his explanation. Tizra velo techtzad, toli banim velo yamutu. Your children, you'll plant seeds. That means you'll have children and they won't die. Lo techtzad means they won't die. That's a beautiful bracha. Ta'ayil velo tipuk. Ta'ayil kalata, you're going to bring in kalot, daughters-in-law. Velo lemutu benach delepkan. So now what does that mean? That your sons won't die, because if your sons die, what will happen? They will leave, right? They'll come in and they won't go out. If they go out, that means that your sons died and they go back to their father's house. Tipuk velo ti'ayil, this is the opposite. You'll have daughters, toli binta, velo yamutu guvrayu velehadro levatech. Right? If you have daughters and the daughters go get married and they live in their house, that's right. You'll send them out and they won't come back. Coming back would mean that their husbands died. So it's a bracha that they won't come back. Lichruv beitach v'litavush pisach. What is this? Tahai alma ush pisach. This world is you're a guest in this world, basically. So it means you'll live in this world. Vahi ulma beita. Dechtiv korbanam batemola olam. Where's your real house? Well, in the end, you'll be in the kever for the long term. So what it means is lichru beitach, your kever will be destroyed, meaning you won't die. Okay, again, I don't know if he's wishing them never to die, right? We know you can't do that, but you won't die and you'll be living as a guest in this world. And when they say kirban batemol olam, Al takli kirbam ela kivram, right? Instead of kirbam, which means, in them, it means kivram, their grave. So now they say, delot tamut, I missed that. Libala ptorach, this is my favorite. B'binei ubinta, you'll be blessed with lots of children that mess up your table, right? We all know you have kids in the house, right? What a mess your house is. There's this great book in Hebrew called Hadoda Shalim Yerachava Nevi'im. If you ever saw it, it's about how she wants to bring kids to the world. And she keeps thinking, if I bring more kids, everything will be organized, and her house becomes a total mess. And then finally she realizes kids are a blessing. And even if they make a mess, like it's all good. And I just have to go with it. So here's this nice idea of your table being messed up is the blessing of having a house full of children. V'lo tehave shata chadita. What is this? You shouldn't live out, you shouldn't see a new year. What does that mean? Delo tamut imtach v'lo tinsav itita acharite, that your wife won't die. You won't have to marry a new wife. Why shana chadasha? Because you're supposed to spend a year making your wife happy. And therefore, we don't want you to have this new year, meaning, right, you should have a whole year to make your wife happy if this wife dies. So it's a blessing that your wife won't die. So there you have it, that he basically explains it all on the positive. Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta iftar minei de Rav. Another similar story. Shimon ben Chalafta goes to leave Rav. Amar le zil legabe delivarchu. So Rav says to his son, go get a bracha from him. Amar le yehe Rava delo titvayesh velo titvayesh. Don't make others embarrassed, and you won't become embarrassed. Ata gabe avua. So he goes back to his father. Amar le my amalach. He said, what did he say to you? Amar le milim ba'al mehud amar li. He said words that I really didn't make any sense out of. Amar le, berachach berchata de berchan kudsha berichu liYisrael utana be. This is the bracha that God, you got the blessing that God gave the Jewish people, and repeat it. Dichtiv, b'chaltem achov asova v'hilaltam. God says you're going to eat a lot of food. Okay, this is a pasuk in Yoel. V'hilaltam v'chulei v'lo yevoshu ami la'olam. My people will never be embarrassed. V'yadatem ki b'kerev Yisrael ani, and everyone will know that I am within the Jewish people. V'lo yevoshu ami la'olam, and my people won't be embarrassed forever. Why does it say it twice? Once is shelo yevayishu, right? One, they won't cause embarrassment to others, and once that they won't become embarrassed. Okay, that's the end of those stories. Now we're moving back to our Mishnah and the details in our Mishnah. So there were some details that we didn't really discuss, which is osai isha takshitesh. You could do her jewelry, which isn't really jewelry, it's really makeup. Tanu Rabbanan, elu hen takshite nashim. This is what they can do. Kochele pokeset mavira srach al paneh. She puts on eyeshadow, she brushes her hair or designs her hair, does something with her hair, and puts on blush. Some people think that it means that she shaves her private parts. Now we're going to see some really interesting sugya. The wife of Rav Chisda would do this in front of her daughter-in-law. Why in front of her daughter-in-law? Some people say it's when she had a daughter-in-law. It was basically the idea here we're going to see is even though she was older and she was married and she already had daughters-in-law, right? People who are in that stage already. Right? The idea is that maybe it doesn't really matter anymore how they look. They're not in their prime. They're not young. They're not in that, looking for a marriage or whatever it might be. Anyway, we're going to see a very interesting sugya about this. Yativ. So now this is what the wife of Rav Chisda did. So Yativ Rav Huna bar Chinana kamed Rav Chisda v'Yativ ka'amar. So now Rav Huna bar Chinana goes to Rav Chisda, whose wife was doing this, and said, Lo shanu ela yaldav al zkena lo. This is only young women, not older women. Amar le, he says to him, Rav Chisda said back to him, Elohim, I swear, afilu imach, afilu imadimach, even your mother, even your grandmother, afilu omeded al kivla, even a woman about to die, okay? She's standing over her grave. She can put on makeup. She can make herself look beautiful. De amre inashe batshitin kebatshit. 60-year-old is like a 6-year-old. Lekal tav lerata. She likes to enjoy the way she looks, the way she takes care of herself, right? And we see this. Right? You can see people even in hospice, right? They really want to look beautiful even to the last day of their lives. And it's very important for their self-worth, for who they are, whether they're married, they're not married, whether, right? It's this great line in the Gemara that really gets to the inner, right? For someone who doesn't wear makeup at all. But I understand that there's this, people like to do that kind of thing. So, and you can see it in the world. And it's very nice that they recognize that and talk about it here. Rabbi Yehuda Omer lo tasud. Now we have this thing about not putting on this seed line that would basically help remove hairs. Tanya Rabbi Yehuda Omer isha lo tasud mifnei shenivuhu. Remember, he disagreed with Tanakh and said you can't do this on Chol Moed because it's disgusting, right? People don't like this on their body, even though in the end there's a good result. Moed Rabbi Yehuda, but in the Braita it says that he agrees though Besid, now we're going to narrow his words. If it's something that you're going to remove before the end of the holiday, then you can, because in the end, even though now it's uncomfortable, at the end of the holiday, you'll want it, right? You'll want the results. She'll be happy later. We're only talking about lime that they would put on for days on end, and then it would continue the entire Chag. That's what he said he doesn't allow. So now they say, Rabbi Yehuda, does he really hold this way? It says in the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, there's a whole halacha about Gentiles who worship idols. Idol worshippers have these holidays, and you're not allowed to do business with them 3 days before because it'll make them happy on their holiday, and they'll go thank their gods. We don't want to be party to that. So he says, though, you're allowed to collect money from them. You can't maybe sell them something because they'll be happy they got this new item or something, but you can collect money that they owe you because that's unpleasant for them. Amrulo, the rabbi said to him, what do you mean? If you pay back a loan, you might be upset that moment, but a few days later, you'll be happy that this big load is off your back. You can't compare these two. Hanach lilchot moed. This is a great line also. What do you mean? We slave in the kitchen on Chol Moed to be happy on the holiday, right? In the end, it's hard work to be able to get to the food that we want to eat. So likewise, right? Anything for the Moed, you can't just enjoy without working. It's a great line. So therefore, they can, that's when it comes to the Moed. But that's not the same thing for these Gentiles. It's a totally different topic. Ravina gives a different answer. Kuti linyan pera'on la'olam metzal. These Ovdei Lilim, which they call kutim here, but really it's akum, really don't even ever want to pay back their loans. So they're not happy when you actually take the money because they were never necessarily planning to pay you back. This is, again, one of those, they can learn in the context of who they were dealing with, and that might have been commonplace in those days. Amari Rav Yehuda. Last part, now we're going to learn all about, you got to wonder why they're talking about this in the Yachshla. I had this in a sugya also before, about what they use for depilatory creams and all sorts of things about that. These girls who weren't yet 12, but they had sa'arot, they had hair on their body, they wanted to get rid of it because they were like too young to have bodily hair. If they were poor, they'd use this line that we've been talking about. They would use this fine flour. The daughters of kings, b'shemen hamor. Special shemen. We learn it from the Megillah. That was what they put all the women in when they were preparing them for going before the king. My shemen hamor, what is this? Rapuna Barchi Amar sitachat. What is that? Well, Rabbi Yomi Amar shemen zayit shaloi b'shlish. We've learned this already. Olive oil that taken from olives that never got to a third of their ripening. Tanya, Rabbi Yehuda Omer ampikinon is shemen zayit shaloi b'shlish. He calls it something else. V'lama sachino to, he says, shemashir tase'ar ma'adenet habasar. It does two things. It both removes the hair and softens the skin. Rabbi Havale Barta, tafla ever shakaba arba me'azuzah. He had a daughter. He did this on her whole body, but he did it part by part. And he had this daughter that was worth so much money that when she got her ketubah, it was double the regular value. There was a Gentile in his neighborhood who had a daughter. He saw what Rav Bibi did. He did this to her all at once, not ever. And yes, we did see this whole sugya. And she died. Amar kat lebibi lebarte. He said he killed my daughter because I looked at what he did. I did what he did, and look, my daughter died. Rav Nachman. Now we're just having a comment about what causes women to have more hair on their bodies. Interesting, take her or leave it. Rabibi deshate shichra baya binte tafla. Ana deloshatina shichra lobayim bintin tfala. He drank a lot of beer, and because of that, his daughter ended up with a lot of hair on her body. We don't drink beer, so our daughters don't have as much hair as his daughter had. End of the sugya. Interesting, you can do with it what you like. I'll just check for you where this was, where we had it. Yes, it was in Masechet Shabbat Daf Pei Amud Bet. Okay, so this whole sugya appeared there. And that's it for today. Have a great day, everyone. A great Shabbat also.